Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sadakar, and this episode is part of our Career Questions series. And today we're talking all about how to create and maintain boundaries at work. My guest today is Christine Kenline. Christine spent 15 years in architecture and design as a workplace strategist and designer, where she put her degrees in social science research to good use. She pivoted her career and became a certified yoga therapist, and she's now finishing a master's in transpersonal therapy and beginning a new chapter of her career as a clinical mental health counselor. In this episode, we talk about how boundaries play a role in creating balance in our lives by managing our workload and our workspaces, and how we can use them in our relationships at work. We go deep into the topic of saying no, discuss why it's so hard to do, and share our own experiences with navigating discomfort, along with sharing some tools and practices that you can use in your own life and career. I'm excited to share this conversation with you. Okay, welcome to Working Your Way. I'm excited to have you on, Christine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sandhya.
So we're going to talk about a topic that is really complicated and complex, but one that I think is increasingly more and more important as it relates to our careers and our lives, and that is boundaries. So let's just talk a little bit about the, I guess, cultural zeitgeist of boundaries and therapy talk and all of those things. Like, it feels like there's a lot of unnuanced takes on very nuanced topics out there right now, boundaries being one of them. And so, I think a lot of times we will see things on social media or read them in books, and it can kind of water down these concepts. And I think at the end of the day, like, something that I believe in very strongly is the advice that we see in the media and get from friends that we see on Instagram is perfectly designed for the person that's giving the advice, not for the person that's receiving the advice, because we all have our own kind of like unique lenses on what we need and what we don't need, and the experience that we're coming from.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like a lot of the information, or I believe a lot of the information that's out there is really generalized for either a broad range of people or, yes, like you said, specifically for the person that's giving the advice. And I think what's happening is it's muddying the water in a way that is getting really confusing for people that are trying to figure out what are boundaries? Why do I even need them? And some of these bigger questions, like why has it become such a big topic right now in our lives?
Yeah, and to me, there's a little bit of, when we have a problem that we're facing, a challenge that we're dealing with, it's so much easier to see something that comes from and I'm going to use air quotes here, that comes from an expert, and say, that's what I need to do, versus kind of like looking inward and saying, like, what do I really need right now? And I can say this from experience, and I think you probably would agree, is that like, I it's very easy for us to be disconnected from what is going on inside of us, and even giving ourselves that space and time to ask ourselves what we really need.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. My personal experience with even just in my inner world, there's almost like two parts that show up. Like I should be doing this, and I really want to be doing this other thing in regards to boundaries and life in general. And so I noticed that I should be acting a certain way or setting boundaries in a certain way is really like other people's voices that have come
Mm.
in and now become part of my inner world because I took it in from social media or from something I read or, something I heard. And now the part of me that's like, but actually that doesn't work for me. Those two are like fighting a lot. And so I noticed that I'm wanting to take in less around topics like boundaries and really listen to the voice that says like, I want, like my voice, not the other voices that are coming in.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So let's like get into defining boundaries. Like, what are they? What do they mean to you? And then we'll talk about where they come up at work. But what do boundaries mean to you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, so I think like a textbook clinical answer is they're the limits that we have for ourselves within relationships. And for me personally, I believe that boundaries are limits or protection for my own identity, my own autonomy in the relationship, and they're protecting my needs and my values as a person.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So there's like, there's two different ways to look at it. Like I appreciate the clinical like response, and then I took it in and filtered it through my own lens and came up with what boundaries actually mean to me, which I think could be really interesting for people to do, is look at information like we were just saying, filter it in and see actually how you want to define that based on who you are as a person. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. When I was thinking about this, right? Because I think there's some natural like, oh, I just know it. But
Yeah.
when I had to put words to it, it was actually a lot harder than I expected it to be. And I think similar in some ways to you, but I think about it kind of as the guardrails that a person would need to maintain their dignity and their sense of well-being.
Mm.
And so when we start to talk about how boundaries come up at work, we'll also talk about things like shutting off your laptop and not checking email after a certain time or things like that too, right? Where I think a lot of times boundaries probably technically are about the relational aspect of like in relationship with other people, where are your boundaries? But I think there's also kind of those physical boundaries of how much am I going to work, or what am I giving to my workplace or my career, or saying yes to certain things, right? So thinking about it in that sense, I think about in terms of relational boundaries, like how I interact with you, how I interact with other people. What do I require to maintain my dignity? So to feel respected, to feel an internal sense of respect, to feel respect from outside. And then the well-being part, I think, is a bit more of what do I need to like be healthy and not necessarily in this moment, but even thinking about it as like a longer term, like what is sustainable for my well-being. So when we talk about things like if I check email for an extra hour at 10 o'clock at night, is that impacting my health today? Maybe not, but might it be impacting my health long term if I continue to do it? Probably.
Yeah. Yeah. What I'm hearing you say is that it sounds like well being and dignity are really important aspects of your personal life and your life in general. And so you're filtering boundaries through those things, that like well being is really important to you as how you live your life. And so the boundaries that you need to be wrapped around that to protect that in a way so that you have a well-being that, it feels good for you.
Yeah. And I think about that well being aspect of like, is this behavior sustainable? If I continue to do these things, is it going to lead me to burnout? Right. I think well being and
Yeah.
burnout go hand in hand when it comes to like
Yeah.
setting boundaries or like shutting things down or saying no when it comes to the workplace.
Yeah, totally. And, you're talking about a lot of boundaries are created for our interpersonal relationships or relationships with other people. And yet there's this new, like, just expansion of technology in the world that we live in now. And even though that's not necessarily a human, another person, it's this really big, like, energy that's in our sphere right now. And so having boundaries with that and creating boundaries maybe that we haven't thought of before in our society until now, in this like decade or place where we're living in, yeah, it seems really important to kind of figure out what boundaries are for technology as well.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of this conversation because it's like we now have access to everything 24/7, right? So even for me in my own life, it's like, okay, well, how early and late am I going to work? And do I want to put time boundaries on those types of things? Or do I lean into like, okay, this is how I work. And like, if I happen to be checking my phone at 5:30 in the morning when I wake up, like, is that a bad thing? And it's such a personal choice because in this world of entrepreneurship, for me, I I kind of like to take advantage of like an idea or a moment of clarity or maybe even a moment where I feel like my mind is like in productive like check things off mode when it happens because it's like, oh, I can kind of like grab onto that energy and like use it in the moment. And so I think for me it's like this constant negotiation of like, is this unhealthy? Because the world is telling me it's unhealthy, actually, to like be working at 8 o'clock at night or to wake up at 4 a.m. with an idea and like want to write it down. Like, but for me, it actually, those moments help me get so much farther ahead sometimes when I then do go to work on something. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's kind of one of those things where I'm like, it is that internal struggle, like you mentioned, of like the world is telling me that I should shut my laptop off at a certain time, but actually what
Yeah.
works for me is um doing the work in those moments when I have the right energy for it.
Yeah, totally. I think what I hear you say is like, yeah, you're listening to your internal clock, like your internal way of being. So you get energy and inspired and like have this motivation to get some things done early in the morning and maybe even late at night because that's what your body is saying. It's like, I'm feeling creative right now, or I'm feeling productive. I'm going to use that to my advantage and get the things done that I need to get done. And then maybe throughout the day, you'll integrate rest at times that maybe don't look normal. I'm putting that in air quotes as well.
Right.
Like normal to like everyone else. Like, I don't know, I'm going to
Yes.
take a nap at 2 p.m. because I had all this productive energy in the morning and now I'm going to rest for a couple hours. And it's hard.
What you're saying in a very professional and diplomatic way is I might work at 5 a.m., but I'm going to take a nap in the afternoon, like, and that is okay for me. Like, it's funny
Yeah.
because I do have moments where people, whether I'm like on Slack or sending an email or something where I like was doing something until midnight and then I'm doing something again at 5 a.m., like even my podcast team, one of the
Yeah.
women's like, do you ever sleep? And I'm like, I promise I do. I actually sleep a lot and I take an afternoon nap like a lot of days, but that's just how I work, right? And that's okay for me. And I don't manage people right now, so I'm not necessarily setting the tone for everybody should be, or I'm not setting an expectation that people should be working really late or really early because I'm not in a leadership position right now, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's what a lot of people are struggling with right now in jobs that are traditionally like the 9 to 5 is because now that we have access 24/7, we went through a pandemic that allowed us to work from home and really kind of not have more stricter boundaries from our employers to be working at a specific time. And so now people are kind of like, just working whenever they want. Um, and so it's hard to kind of go back into those really confining ways of working. I've been hearing a lot of people struggling with that because for some people, it just doesn't work for them. And so, how do we work within those boundaries of our employers if we are working 9 to 5? I think is a big question.
Yeah, it's exactly right. It's the idea. I mean, that now technology enables us to be connected all the time. And so there's more responsibility and ownership that we have to take each in our own lives about what works best for us. And so when you talk about, physical boundaries versus relational boundaries, I think about physical boundaries are things like how late am I going to be working? Am I accessible when I'm not, on the clock? Or do I put my office in a certain room where I can shut the door and like physically disconnect from it? Or is my desk in my bedroom where I see it all the time? And so I'm constantly thinking about it just because it's there. And so I think those are things that everybody can kind of consider for themselves around, do you want kind of more rigid rules around technology and work time and workspace, and even workload, right? How much am I going to say yes to? How much am I going to take on versus making those priority calls or pushing back when some more additional work is getting assigned to you and you just don't have the capacity for it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a word that's showing up for me or a concept is balance. Like, how does a person find balance between, the expectations of their work life and maybe the expectations of their role at work, and also all the other aspects of life that are important to a person? And so, how does someone navigate that? And I believe that's kind of what a lot of people are struggling with. There's just so much that people want to do and like to experience in life, and work is also a really big part of it. And you have access to work, to technology 24/7. It's like, when do you turn that off and be able to also live the rest of your life?
Yeah. And for me, what that just brought up is um the idea of values, right? Like, what are your core values? What is important to you? And does your schedule, the way that you're spending the hours in your day, align to what you care about? And then there's this other element of it where for me, work is really important to me. It is actually something that is meaningful to me and that I care a lot about. And there's still a limit on how much brain space or energy that I can and should, and I use should in a personal, like, I know that I should not spend all my
Yeah.
time working because I will burn myself out. I will, overload myself mentally and like then not actually be able to show up back to work in a way that feels like refreshed and productive.
Yeah, definitely. And I've heard you say burnout a couple times. And I think it's really interesting to talk about like burnout. Like, how do you know when you're starting to feel burnt out? Like, you've pushed yourself to the limit, you've overextended, you had some maybe porous boundaries, like there weren't boundaries really there. And you're like, I'm just going to keep going. And then all of a sudden, something happens and you are now experiencing burnout. Like, I'm like remembering like I had a really big moment like that actually at the end of like 2018, where I was really struggling with boundaries in my workplace for many, many, many years. And I burnt out, and I literally felt my body collapse. Like, I couldn't think, I couldn't show up as myself at work. I was so tired and exhausted all the time. All I wanted to do was sleep. Um, I just, yeah, literally went into a collapse mode of being. And when I finally found myself there, I was like, oh, this is burnout. This is like a really extreme case of burnout, but here I am.
Yeah.
And that's what happened, I believe, now, due to like just struggling with saying no, or struggling with really listening to what my body needed and my mind and my emotional self, like all parts of myself needed in the workplace and in my life.
Yeah. So, what was going on for you at that time? What were some of the things that you think contributed to it, both internally and external?
Yeah, I came to a point in my life where I was working in the corporate world as a workplace strategist. So I was living and doing that job, and then I also started to have other, I would call them passions or interests, in how I wanted to show up for other people and be of service to other people. So this part of me turned on, where I was like, I want to be of service to other people in different ways. And I became a yoga teacher, and I started to get involved with community, and all of this other stuff came into my life. And so I was trying to navigate now my old way of being, working a lot. It was important to me. Then also trying to teach yoga and trying to be in my community. And it was too much to juggle. And I was trying to do it all. And so I think I was transforming on the inside, and even maybe unknown to me at the time, pivoting my career, but I just didn't know it, that I was trying to like navigate that pivot in my life and everything. Yeah, I tried to do everything at once.
Right, like trying to fit 20 gallons of stuff in a 10-gallon bucket. And
Yeah.
on one hand, it's interesting because it was stuff that was really meaningful to you that you were adding in, but not letting go of any of the stuff that maybe was becoming less meaningful to you. And it was also paying your paycheck and your health insurance and your rent. So,
Yeah, it was like I couldn't give that up. I needed to live. It was helping me meet my basic needs and survive in a way. And yet all of these other things, I felt alive. Like, and I hadn't felt that way in a really long time, and I didn't know it. And so all these other things were like really sparking this like inner fire within me and wanting me to like spend my time and energy there. So like, again, how do you balance, or how do I balance all of it? I didn't do that very well, and I burnt out. And so it was almost like a forced time off. I had to take time off to take care of myself.
how did that work with your workplace? Were you able to take time off? Like,
I think I found myself toward the end. I was actually like I said, unknown to me at the time. It was unconscious that like I was kind of coming to the end of my career in that field, and I was working at a startup at the time, and I could work really anytime I wanted to, anywhere I wanted to. It was really flexible. This was in 2018. So at the time, startups were offering unlimited paid time off. So I found myself, I chose to be in this job, but I think it was like a blessing in disguise at the time
yeah.
that I had unlimited time off. And so I took a month off at the end of 2018. And I actually went to India to practice yoga and to sleep, which is what I actually ended up doing most of the time. Because I just slept a lot. So that's what it looked like. And I'm really grateful that I had that opportunity and I was in that job that allowed me the space to sleep and really, like you said, take care of my well-being, like to really focus on that.
So that a lot of that was kind of the physical boundaries of like how much time you're spending working and just going and going and going. Now, the other thing that, we want to talk about here is like relational boundaries, which those come up obviously a lot in our lives, but in terms of how they come up at work, I think when we talk about physical boundaries of like these are kind of, for the most part, things we can control. Now, there's some human stuff that gets in the way, which we'll talk about later. But when it comes to relational boundaries, we're now in a situation where it's dependent on another person. And so this is where I think about like respect and dignity and what we are willing to accept and allow from people in order to protect that. And so that's where I think about boundaries when it comes to relational boundaries is how you communicate with people or how you allow them to communicate with you or how you allow them to treat you is where we might say, I need to set a boundary here. My boss is rude every time they ask me to do things or they're really critical of me or they're asking me to be someone who I'm not, right? They're asking me to hide parts of my identity at work or that type of thing. And so that's where I would think about relational boundaries being, what do you need? What are the guardrails in order for you to kind of maintain your sense of dignity and respect and even autonomy in a certain way? But how do you think about relational boundaries when it might come to the workplace?
I think for me, This is something that I struggled with in my previous career. So I'm speaking from a place of now looking back and taking those lessons learned and trying my best to practice them now. And so what I learned was that from this place, like I want to understand when the other person's point of view as well. So when I'm expressing a no, or I'm noticing that I'm getting pushed beyond my limits at work, and I say no, and maybe it's not received or understood, I want to ask the other person, like, what's going on here that it's hard for you to understand where I'm coming from? So I think there's like an empathy that needs to happen in that relationship to understand each other's point of views, understand where your coworker or your boss is coming from, and also for them to understand where you're coming from and how can you navigate that conflict, and learn from that. I think that's something I struggled with a lot was, I mean, even before we started this podcast, I was saying, oh, I'm feeling a little nervous. I don't know where this conversation is going to go. And that is a very common theme in my life is like, oh, I don't want to express this boundary or say no because I don't know how the other person is going to receive it or where it's going to go. So then I hold back and I don't say anything because of fear of someone rejecting that no. And I believe this is a common experience for many people because I'm not sure, like, this is my job on the line. This is my livelihood. This is like supporting me. And if I express something that I need that another person does not want to accept or it doesn't work, what's that mean in my work relationship? What's going to happen? And I think that's a really big question.
Yeah. And that's where some of this, I mean, the human stuff comes in when we're setting physical boundaries, but especially when we're setting relational boundaries. I can remember an experience. This was very early on in my business, and I had been doing these Enneagram workshops for teams, and I had created everything that I did from scratch. Like I built out all of my materials. Like I didn't get any, like content from any other organizations or anything like that. And so I put a lot of heart and soul and time and energy into doing that. And I remember there was a woman that I had been in like a coaching program with, and she was like, I want to start doing Enneagram work. I'd love if you would share your decks with me or presentations with me. I'm happy to share, anything that I have that might be helpful for you. And I really had to think about it for a while. And talk about body responses, like the adrenaline. And this is over email. It wasn't even in a live conversation, right? The adrenaline that was coursing through my body to be like, one, this doesn't feel good. I actually started to recognize that, like, I felt a little angry that she even asked and put me in that position to say, will you just give me all of your work so I can use it? And so I basically said, like, I've created all of this stuff. Like, I don't really necessarily feel comfortable just like sharing all of this content that I've created. And what I got back from her was like, I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically it was like, I'm the kind of woman who likes to support other women, and I would be happy to share any of my stuff with you. But if you don't feel comfortable, that's fine. And that made me even more angry because I was like, oh, don't pull the feminism card on me just because I don't want to give away like hours and weeks of my work to you for free so that you can use it.
Yeah.
I just was like, that whole experience was so interesting. But like, I consider that like a type of boundary that I set at work of like, no, I don't feel comfortable sharing this. And I had to say it. And this comes up in the boundary discussion a lot. We have to be okay with the consequences of setting that boundary if the other person is not willing to respect it. And so I don't talk to her anymore. We like kind of that changed our relationship. And I had to kind of be okay with that because what I thought was when I express what's going on with me, she's going to get it and be like, oh, I totally understand. I'm so sorry I even asked. No, that did not happen. It was actually thrown back in my face that now I don't support women, And so those types of no's that like to your point, I could feel it already in my body. I was mad that she even asked me. And so I was like, okay, to me this means I'm feeling some kind of lack of respect here, and therefore like I'm going to stand up for myself. And then when I got kind of like a flippant response, I was like, maybe that made it easier to let go of, right? But these are the kinds of things, like it's a very human response. And what you said about like, is my no not going to be received? I think that's really important to not like downplay or underestimate these moments that like this is some real human stuff of like I always want people to think highly of me, and I want them to like me, and I want them to respect me, and when I say no to something I have to be okay with now I'm the bad guy in this person's version of the story, and it's taken me a lot of work to get over those kinds of moments.
Yeah, I completely agree. I have that people pleasing tendency where I just want everyone to like me. I do not like, I have really have struggled with conflict in my relationships, specifically at work. Um, because I've felt the repercussions of that conflict as an employee. Yeah, as an employee. Yeah, so now I really liked what you said. Something that came up for me was like the pausing and asking the other person, like, even if you do want to say no and you already know it right away, to say, I'm going to pause and think about this, or may I get back with you? So that it gives you space. It sounds like it gives you space to check in with your body. You're learning a lot about yourself. Usually your body is going to say no or yes immediately. And I think sometimes we bypass that or disregard it because we're moving so fast in conversation and reacting versus responding. And so listening to, I don't know, when I listen to my body and ask it like kind of what's going on here, I get curious, like the adrenaline rush, it sounds like you were saying, starting to kind of get really heated, like something's going on inside that's saying something to you. And so it's like, how can I create space to listen to that and learn from it and give myself the space to like get curious around like what's actually happening inside? Because that
Yeah.
most likely will come up over and over again when you want to say no, is like that similar response of like, oh, this is my internal no. Like it's already, these are the signals. These are the signs that I actually want to say no in this. So you just learn and you just keep on practicing. That's kind of what I've learned from, all of the times that I wish I said no and I did not.
Yeah, and this was so for me, this was like a couple of years ago, right? So I'm like already well into my own kind of like work on understanding my emotions and actually giving myself space to
Yeah.
process them and all of this stuff. But had this been like 10 years ago, I have no idea. I probably would have just said yes. I would have sent it, and then I would have felt bad about myself, or like almost kind of like a little sad for not standing up for myself. But then in this moment now, I was able to separate like, okay, if I'm angry, that's a sign. That's a sign of something for me. And in my work with Enneagram and emotions, I can understand like anger is often a sign of an infringement on respect or autonomy or dignity in some way, right? And so it's like that's going on. Okay, let me hold that. And then there's the fear response, which is the adrenaline stuff that was going on for me. That's how it shows up for me when I have to risk a relationship. When I'm putting a connection on the line, and it doesn't happen with every connection, but like I notice it for sure when I have to say something that I think is going to disappoint someone, upset someone, create conflict. Like I know what that feeling is like, because it's like, okay, this is a dangerous thing to do, and a lot of that comes from my childhood and my upbringing and
Yeah.
just wanting to belong, right? Like belonging was like my core driving force for so much of my life. And now I have to kind of like counter that sometimes. And I think, yeah, I've learned to kind of sort those things out, but it's taken a lot of practice. And then to say, okay, well, what does this mean? And what does this mean? And to your point, I think in all of that, giving yourself some space and time to process. When it's written communication, it's much easier, right? Because I was emailing back and forth with this
Yeah.
person. It was easy for me to like take a beat and whatever. But in an actual conversation, I think it's something that we should really normalize a lot more to say, can I get back to
Yeah.
you on that? Right? Even if it's your boss asking for some extra stuff and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm already overwhelmed. Like, can I get back to you on that? Is like, should be our best friend when it comes to conversations at work.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, it would give, like, if I was in that place, it would give me time to think, like, I'm already overwhelmed. How can I like integrate this into my schedule? Maybe somehow compromise, like still get that ask done, but it might be on a different timeline or it might look a little different. But it gives me time to kind of navigate that versus like saying yes and then going, oh no, like how am I actually going to do this? Or saying no and then realizing that, oh, I actually do have a little bit of space in my schedule here. I could have accepted that. So I think just giving that pause is so important.
Yeah.
And I agree with you about the in person. For me, it's so much harder to have these conversations in person and being able to navigate that. Especially I've noticed in my past with like, my boss. Like it was really hard for me to say no to people in a position that were in a place higher than me in the company or in the corporation. Because I really liked my job and I wanted to continue to succeed and do well. And I felt the need to like prove myself. And so I took on more and more and more responsibility, hoping that I would be seen and like recognized for all of this extra work, which, has to do again with my childhood and like the way I'm kind of like programmed or organized. And yeah, so I found myself like in this place of like just really struggling with those conversations in person. And it's taken a lot of time, patience with myself, compassion, and practice with other people now in my new career that I'm starting.
What were the differences for you maybe at the time or that you can see now when you are setting a boundary and there's a person in a position of power involved versus setting a boundary and say it's like with me, a friend? How do you see the differences in those kinds of situations for you?
That's a really good question. I feel like for me, it's easier to say no to peers, like friends, people like I don't know. It's like I know you, I know my friends, and they kind of know where I'm coming from when I say no. And they're not so much like asking me to change my decision because of some reason or another. They're like, oh, okay, that's fine. Because they know who I am as a person and they know what I value and they know what I believe in. Whereas someone in a position of power, sometimes it doesn't feel as personal. Like it's like they don't know fully who I am. Maybe I've never communicated that to them or shared what I value or shared who I am as a person. And so when I say no, it feels harder because I feel the need to have to explain myself. Like I'm saying no because, and I give this whole explanation of like, I'm saying no because well, X, Y, and Z. Like I need to say, like give them a reason of why I'm saying no so that it somehow validates it. And a position of power feels like there's some power over me in my job. Like where do I go? Like, am I going to get in trouble if I say no? That's like a big thing for me. Am I going to get in trouble? Or, am I not going to get that promotion that I was working toward? Like, there feels like repercussions in that power dynamic versus that doesn't really exist with friends.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I now I'm thinking about in terms of when we have to say no to things, oftentimes we are putting something at risk, and that can be relationships if it's with a peer or somebody you care about, or even our family members, right? And then there's risk to resources, which is if you're saying no to somebody who has some power over your resources, your paycheck, your promotion, that's a very different kind of risk. And I think based on what I know about how we develop as children, each one of us actually, there's neither one of them is worse or more important than the others. I think it's actually just based on how we're wired individually as to which one do we actually perceive as like
Yeah.
a bigger threat to our safety, like risking a relationship or risking my resources.
Yeah.
And I've always been more of a relationship risk averse versus resources risk averse, largely because, I grew up in a middle class family. We always had food, we always had whatever we needed, right? I didn't have any kind of like deeper self-preservation kind of things that I wasn't getting as a kid. And I don't think this is
Yeah.
universal for everybody, right? It's like everybody picks up on different things, but that belonging piece for me was always so important. So now, even now, I'm like, okay, I can quit my job, I can say no to a boss. I had a confrontation with someone I was doing contract work for because I was like, we disagree on this, we are not aligned on values, like I'm gonna push back. And I was like, fine. Like it was not it didn't hit me in the same way that if I were to have a really good friend and tell them that something that they did really upset me, that would be so much harder for me to do. And I think, again, it's a personal kind of
Yeah.
individual response that we might have.
Oh, I completely agree. Like, yeah, I think I used to be like that. I was reversed. And now the last like 5 years for me, or 4 years, 4 or 5 years, I've been in this pivot in my career. So my resources feel less accessible. And there's just not as much of them as when I had a full-time job and I had everything that I needed. Now that I'm in graduate school and moving into a different career, my resources don't feel as secure to me. And my relationships that I've been putting energy and time in and built feel more secure. And so I feel okay pushing back a little bit, whereas my resources right now feel a little bit unstable. And so that feels harder. And I think that's an interesting thing that we're talking about is like what feels safe and secure in your life and what doesn't. And the things that don't are the things that might be hard to set boundaries for, because what happens if they go away?
Yeah, it's so right. So one of the things that I was thinking about as we were like talking about doing this episode is the different Enneagram types and how each one maybe has some challenges with boundaries or maybe doesn't have challenges with boundaries. And one of the concepts that you and I are both very familiar with, it comes from the work of Nedra Glover Tawwab, is boundaries exist on a spectrum. And so they can be porous, they're very loosey goosey and we don't really hold to them, or they can be very rigid and we're like, in all instances, I'm never going to do XYZ. And probably somewhere in the middle or somewhere along that spectrum is what would be like healthy boundaries, where we're holding very firm to the things that matter to us, but we're allowing for some flexibility, for some exceptions to those rules, and we can have that flow and trust ourselves that we're doing the right thing when we do stretch or make an exception or kind of let one thing through that boundary. So do you have some thoughts around like the spectrum of boundaries? And then we'll get into some of the
Yeah,
Enneagram kind of insights that I was thinking about.
I love her book. How to setting boundaries. And I think like I just imagine water, I guess, in this situation where there's like a wall. When you have really rigid boundaries, there's a wall there and nothing is getting through. No water is able to seep in. You're not allowing anyone, because this has to do a lot with our relationships. You're not allowing anyone access into you as a person, like who you are and what you believe in. And no one can see past that wall. So you're almost like blocking that connection with other people. And that's really what happens with rigid boundaries. Whereas you flow to the other side and maybe there's absolutely no wall, there's nothing there, and the water is just flooding in. And you're getting literally flooded with information and requests. And really, you just are drowning in the relationship. Like you can't see yourself as a separate person. You are completely enmeshed with the relationship that you're in, and you're just overwhelmed. And so, somewhere in between, there's like a filter that slows that water down. But it's like the balance that you find with finding connection and being able to connect with people, but not being completely flooded and drowning in the other person in a way. So that's kind of how I would describe it.
I love that. And then I think about when we translate it into day-to-day workplace kinds of things, it can look like I work between the hours of 9 to 5, which is pretty much true for me. And or I'll meet with clients only Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Now, if I said, okay, that's a boundary, 9 to 5, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, like if I have a rigid boundary around that, like something might come up that somebody does need something, or there's an opportunity that I would want to take advantage of. But if I'm rigid about that boundary, then it's like always a no. If I'm porous about my boundaries and I'm like, oh, you want to meet at Friday at 8:00? Like, great, that's fine. That totally works for me, And it's like, for me, it's somewhere in the middle where I'm constantly, it's a case by case basis of like, okay, am I going to go outside of the set client hours that I've determined help me work best so that I have my Mondays and my Fridays to do deep thinking work and creating things and, whatever. I let some exceptions through that sometimes because they're worth it for me and they're worth it for whoever it is that I'm making that exception for. It's to me, it's a question of like, is there value in doing this for kind of both parties, right? And so I think the idea of like, if you work in a corporate job, I'm never ever going to work more than 40 hours a week. It's like sometimes there's a big project or a big client deliverable or something, and then we have to stretch beyond our boundary. And then others, we might be able to take some of that time back. And so I think it's a matter of like, again, like checking in with yourself and like, does this feel like an okay exception to make to a boundary that I have set? It's not going to be 100% rigid. It's not going to be 100% porous. It's going to be somewhere in the middle where I can actually check in with myself to see like, does this still feel like it's supporting my well-being or my dignity or whatever it is that we want to kind of use as our criteria?
Yeah. And it sounds like, discernment is really that filter. Like, is this going to support me? Am I going to overextend myself by saying yes to being flexible with this other person? And for me, I think like, how can I give myself, like, if am pushing a little bit to the edge of my capacity as a person, maybe what's one thing I can do to give back to myself to fill that cup back up? So like if I'm really focused on well-being, like what's some self-care practice that I can do maybe even the following week, take a little bit less time from work, take time from work and do something extra for myself since I did push my capacity the week before.
Yeah, I like that. It's like, what can I do to kind of rebalance, right? What can I do to kind of bring that back to where I would have liked it to be? I like that a lot. One of the things that I think about when I think about different Enneagram types are things like, that's largely where I get the context of like, advice is not one size fits all, right? It never will be, it never should be. And so there is a lot of advice about like protect your peace and set boundaries and things like that, right? On Instagram and wherever else.
Yeah.
And there are certain types that actually have much more rigid boundaries around connection, around being vulnerable. I will not be vulnerable. I don't want people to see my weakness, or I'm going to detach emotionally because I feel like emotionally overwhelmed. Like, I think the different types have these different ways of being. And so like some of them from a relational standpoint, actually might need to be less rigid with their boundaries when it comes to connection, or might need to be like a type 8, as an example, doesn't want to ever be vulnerable. And so they don't let a lot of people in often. Now, they may need to loosen or like kind of create a little more flexibility in their boundaries around connecting with people. But then they probably need to set stronger boundaries when it comes to taking on more stuff, because they have this kind of visceral, like, lean in, like, I'm going to do more and more and more and more, and not recognize that I have limitations as a person, because I want to control, because I want to make sure that this is successful, because I want to make sure that this like project or whatever is as strong as it needs to be. And so there, even in one type of person, you need to maybe firm up boundaries in one area of your life, and you need to kind of like chill out on them a little bit in the other. And all of
Yeah.
the types kind of have these different things. And so I think it's so interesting to think about, advice and how like it's just not right for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, I relate to that so much. When you were sharing a little bit more about the Enneagram, I realized that my definition of boundaries aligns with my type 4. And like wanting autonomy, wanting that self-identity, wanting to protect that energy within myself, my personal energy in my work, in my relationships with other people. And it just felt like, when I was kind of exploring that a little bit more, I was like, oh, that's really interesting that that kind of leans into my type and why I define it
Yeah.
that way. I'm curious if you've noticed that about yourself.
Yes. I think one of the things, and you and I kind of had a separate conversation about this, but
Yeah.
so the type 3, the kind of core motivation is to be valuable. And type 3s often do that by being successful, by managing their image to make sure they appear to be successful in whatever role it is, right? Career, relationships, whatever. And for me, I find myself, this is interesting because I actually just applied for this program, and they asked like, what are your growth opportunities? And one of my
Yeah.
growth opportunities when it comes to facilitating and coaching is that I always kind of I want to over deliver in value for my clients. And while that's not on the surface a bad thing, what it can do is I will spend 90 minutes on a coaching call instead of 60, when I'm only really charging them for 60, because I'm like, oh, we have so much more we could do. And I just want them to get value out of it. And then also, like, kind of oftentimes I just cram too much stuff into a workshop, because I'm like, oh, there's this is going to be so helpful, and this will be great.
Yeah.
And we need to talk about this too. And it's like, part of it is letting people learn at a pace that is best for them, letting them get to their own conclusions, right? And so when I'm over delivering on value, can in some instances be robbing them of the opportunity to get there on their own, right? Or not like charging as much as I should be, because I'm like, I want to do all these extra things. So I don't necessarily
Yeah.
think it's a bad thing like 100% of the time, but I do think it's one of those things that if I'm really thinking about what's best for me and what's best for the client, that is something that I
Yeah.
need to work on, and I continue to work on it.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, I look back at my previous career, and I noticed that like I struggled with like standardization, like just following the same rules. Like I always wanted everything to have this like unique touch, be different. Um
Yeah.
which is like very very much my 4 coming out. I'm like, we can't do the same thing. Like we have to do something different and like be unique, make this project stand out. Um and I also notice it coming into my world now as a therapist, is just like the business that I want to create. Like, what do I want to do next? Like, I need to create something that's unique that no one's done before. And it needs to be a special thing. I can't do what someone else is doing. Like, I need to show up in a completely unique way. And I just laugh at myself most of the time when that shows up, because I'm just like, wow, like this desire to just be different and do something different is so much a part of me. And it is like a growth area for me, like in my life. So I'm curious to
I
like
wonder.
know more.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I wonder how much of that played into your nervousness even around doing this podcast episode, that like it needs to be unique and extraordinary, and the pressure that can come along with that self-imposed standard. And I'm learning this also, so I'm going to say this out loud for both of us, is that like anything that we do is going to be unique and special in its own way, because it's you doing it, not anyone else, right? It will have its own uniqueness just because of that. But it's hard, it's, yeah, easier said than done to believe.
Yeah, it's easier said than done. And that's such a great reminder to like, yeah, just realize that yeah, it did play a role into my nervousness. Like I need to say something spectacular, like, oh, that's like the biggest thing. I've never heard that before from anyone about boundaries. and and that does play, yeah, it's interesting to notice when that comes in my life. So
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot about types of boundaries, about when they come up at work. What I would love to do is, so we also talked about a lot of these reasons why it's hard to set boundaries, both like, okay, my internal, programming says I need to do this, or eh, I can't risk this. And so I think having people kind of recognize like the reason setting boundaries is hard is not, it's not a like, okay, I'm just going to work these hours and like done. It's not a mindset thing, right? If it were that easy, I think we would all be doing it. It's important to remember there's some like real, quote unquote, like threats to our safety that are kind of simmering underneath the surface that we maybe aren't totally always aware of. And that's what leads to it being hard to say no to people, to shut off at a certain hour and like be like, whatever emails that come in are not going to be that important that I need to check it, right? To like turn
yeah.
those things off in us when we've lived our whole lives, oftentimes being successful because of the thing that we're now trying to turn off. I think it's really important to note like it is hard and there's a reason, and we can kind of have some tools to check in with ourselves, even if it's just a pause, even if it's just a breath, even if it's just a can I get back to you on that with your boss? But I'd love for you if you can share a little bit about like, as a yoga therapist, as a therapist, and doing a lot of body-based work yourself, whether it's professionally or in your own experience, what are
Yeah.
some ways that people can check in on those things? Maybe ease the tension or even just notice them.
So I think for me, I've learned this through my own personal experience, and I have also now implemented it with the clients that I see in my somatic way of working as a therapist. And one practice that I believe would be really interesting for anyone to do is to check in with their relationship with yes and no. And what I mean by that is notice when you want to say no, for example, notice what's showing up in your body. Take a moment to just turn inward and notice, like you had said, like there's a lot of like energy flowing in your middle section. There's a lot of heat that's coming to the surface. Like, okay, I want to say no. My body is saying this. Notice like when you do say no out loud, like what's the tone of voice that you're using? What's the volume that it comes out? Sometimes when we're uncertain about no, we're like, no, like really, really timid. And just to kind of just tune in, like what's going on, and also play with that. So maybe you start to say no really loud, say it in different tones of voices, and just notice like what happens internally in your body when you start to shift the energy around no, and what's going on. And I invite, yeah, everyone to do that with yes as well. Like, because it's also sometimes hard for people to say yes to things. And so just noticing, like, what's your yes right now? What's your present moment experience of yes? How does that feel in your body? And what happens if you play with the different levers of yes around the tone of voice, the volume, like what's showing up when you start to like tune in and practice it with someone that you trust. Could be a friend, a family member. Just notice, like, what's it like to say yes or no and practice that with them. And what are you learning about yourself and your body? So
I love
that would be
Yeah.
just, I just think there's so much curiosity that surfaces, at least for me when I do that. I learn a lot about how I probably, some patterns that are in me, maybe from childhood, or how I've kind of been programmed to respond. And so it just gives a person more information about themselves, which then you get to choose what to do with that.
That
Where
is
do you want
such
to
a
go
great
with that?
practice. Yeah, I think it makes me think of something that just really recently happened where I ended up saying no to something, but I was really like going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And I gave myself a second to say, okay, let's like pretend that you said yes to this. And I had this feeling of like kind of dread and like like a heavy kind of weird, just kind of like ugh kind of feeling in my body. And then when I like imagined myself saying no to it, I felt relief. And just like letting myself I play out those two scenarios just hypothetically and feeling into what it felt like for me, I was like, oh, I have to say no to this. Like, if I feel relief when I imagine myself saying no, then I have to say no.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I had to get over the other parts of what that would mean to say no and the discomfort that would bring up for other reasons, right? But
Yeah.
I think it's also important to think about the idea of like, how can we expand our tolerance for discomfort? Because there will be a consequence either way when we have to say yes or say no. Either then we deal with doing the thing when we say yes, or we say no and we deal with whatever risk kind of comes up for us, right? Around relationships or resources or whatever else. And how can we kind of let ourselves find ways to just sit with those uncomfortable emotions that might come up in either scenario?
That's such a good point. Yeah, living with the discomfort and like it really is expanding someone's window of tolerance when you start to just learn to be with the discomfort. And I think that it just takes practice, just learning and continual practice that it will continue to expand the ability to sit with the discomfort. I also think it's interesting what you said around you checked in with your body. It gave you an answer when you played out the two scenarios, and then the mind comes in. And the mind's like starting to like really spin out. It spins us out. I feel like it just spins us out and it starts to question what the body already knows, what we already know deep inside. And so that living with the discomfort, I think also is understanding that your mind is a really big part of that discomfort and all of the things that flood in. And so just learning to kind of, witness what's happening when the mind starts coming in and and practicing kind of allowing that to happen, but kind of going back to your body and listening, like, what is it actually saying? If I can remove or just not listen to, turn down the volume of the mind for a moment. So, and that just takes practice. Yeah.
It takes practice is like, repeat that 18 more times, because this is coming from like describing my experience of these things. Like, this is coming from someone who for the first 38 years of her life did not ever stop I'm talking about me, obviously. Like, I did not ever stop to like feel what was going on in my body or check in with myself on things, like I lived in my head and it was like pros and cons and rational thinking and just like forward movement all the time. And so like it has taken work to kind of like be able to sort those things out, but it's very possible. Like if I can do it, anyone can do it. It just takes that slowing down and the checking in and the having some of these tools. Like I love the tool that you shared around feeling into the yes and feeling into the no.
Yeah.
Any parting thoughts? We'll share a couple of resources that people can look up, but any parting thoughts from you?
Maybe I just say from all of this, filter, use that discernment, take in what landed for you as a listener and use that to get curious about yourself and why that lands for you. Maybe practice this exercise and see what happens. So I think just use your discernment and get really curious about yourself around what is meaningful to you and leave all the rest behind.
I love that. That's perfect.
Yeah.
So I'm going to link a couple of things in the show notes for everybody. So the book that we talked about, Set Boundaries, Find Peace, from Nedra Glover Tawwab. I think this goes just like much deeper into, especially that relational boundary part, right? But I think even when we're saying no to work, there's a relational component to it. So boundaries really are all about what's going on with other people, with interpersonal, and what's going on inside of ourselves, intrapersonal, about why it's hard for things to happen. And then I'm going to link something that's a little more heady, an HBR podcast episode about setting boundaries at work that might be a little more tactically helpful. And then I think you have a book recommendation that you really like.
Yes. If you are a person that like wants to view boundaries through the lens of spirituality, I've really appreciated Pixie Lighthorse's book called Boundaries and Protection. It just gives a broader perspective and integrates kind of the body, mind, spirit into understanding boundaries for oneself.
Great. I think that's a good range of options. We'll do something that's a little more purely intellectual, a little more spiritual, and something that's probably in the middle. So
yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Yeah, this was great. It was actually great for me to process some of these things too. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I'm doing that, or that's what happened in that moment. So
yeah, same. I really enjoyed our conversation. It like really kind of started getting me like processing and thinking about some of these things more.
Amazing. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for being on.
Yeah, thank you.